Hello, English 9. We are continuing with grammar, and I know you're incredibly excited about it. So we are starting our packet, and this packet is going to be the clause packet. So if you look at it in terms of grading, you're going to see it entered in as the clauses packet, which is going to be due Friday. Also, the quiz, oops, sorry, it's not a quiz. It's a test on grammar. Is also on Friday. Okay, you already took your pre-test in grammar. Now you are going to be taking your post-test. So let's look at clauses here. Things are getting a little bit more difficult, but at the same time, things should start making more sense because we have the vocabulary in order to do them. Now, why are we talking about complex sentences? The simple sentences that are typically written are ones that appear simple in regards to how people look at them. We want to write more complex sentences as we go forward. One thing that we could say is that they make you sound smarter, but it's not necessarily that. The reason that they're more complex is they give you an ability to communicate better because they're giving you a different way to communicate. So, a complex sentence is a sentence that contains one main clause and one or more subordinate clauses. Okay, so this is what we're looking at in terms of a complex sentence. Our simple sentences are only going to contain a main clause. Now, a clause, okay, this is not clause like Santa Claus, and it's not clause like those on a grizzly bear, okay? A clause is a group of words that contains a subject and a verb. There are two types of clauses, main and subordinate. A main clause, also called an independent clause, okay, and this is important, can stand alone as a sentence. A simple sentence has one main clause. A compound sentence has two or more main clauses. The weather changed, we went outside. A subordinate clause also has a subject and a predicate, but it cannot stand by itself as a sentence. It is often introduced by a subordinating conjunction such as when, if, because, or until. Because the weather changed when we went outside. Okay, so these ones would be two separate examples of subordinating clauses. Okay, main clause stands on its own. Compound sentence has two or more main clauses. Each of these main clauses can stand alone. Analyzing complex sentences. In each of the following complex sentences, find the subordinate clause. Underline its subject once and its verb twice. Then circle the subordinating conjunction. Okay, so we have an example here. So we have a subject, we have a verb, and so our verb goes twice, our subject is once, and then our subordinating conjunction. So although our team fought hard, we finally lost the game. Okay, so we're looking at these. We have although, team, fought. Okay, so we're going to have, if you see Rita, please tell her to return my lunchbox. So we have if. Okay, we're going to look at the C is going to be our verb. Okay, and you is our subject. When my grandmother was young, she listened to Frank Sinatra records. We're going to have when, grandmother, and was. Until you change their strings, your banjo won't sound very good. You have until, you have you, and change. Turning the page. What is a clause? This is going to tell you the same thing, but it's going to do it in a slightly different way. Okay, so we have a clause as a group of words that contains both a subject and a verb. There are two types, the independent and the dependent. Okay, so remember our independent is also known as a main, and our dependent is also known as a subordinate. An independent clause expresses a complete thought and stand alone. An independent clause is also called a main clause. The gardener calculated the total area. A dependent clause contains a subject and a verb, but it does not express a complete thought. It cannot stand alone as a sentence. Another name for a dependent clause is a subordinate clause. Most dependent clauses are introduced by words, although, before, because, so that, when, while, so, and that. After she had measured the plot carefully. A dependent clause can be joined to an independent, so we can have a dependent and an independent to express a complete thought. The gardener calculated the total area after she had measured the plot carefully. So remember, this one here, okay, is going to be independent, IND, because it can stand alone. We don't need anything more. That makes sense. However, if we just took the front part off and said after she had measured the plot carefully, this one can't stand alone. It needs the other part of the sentence in order to make sense. So that's what makes it dependent, or you can call it, remember, a subordinate. So identify each boldface group of words by writing IND for independent clause and DEP for dependent clause. So Joyce enjoyed geometry more than she enjoyed algebra. Remember, if it stands alone, if it makes sense without the rest of the sentence, if we get rid of it, Joyce enjoyed geometry. Makes sense. So it can stand alone. It is independent. It doesn't need anything else. She liked the fact that the class began with simple shapes. If we take away the rest of it, that the class began with simple shapes doesn't make any sense. We need the rest of that sentence in order for it to make sense. This part depends on the main clause to make sense, so it is a dependent. A point was the first thing that the students learned about. Okay, remember we take away part of it. A point was the first thing. That makes sense by itself, so that makes it independent. This is more practice for you, okay, with this independent and dependent clause. So I'm going to remind myself, it says in here, in the following sentence, underline each main clause once and each subordinating clause twice. Okay, we're going to remind ourselves that main clause also can be the independent and the subordinating clause can be the dependent. So I remind myself, the independent can stand alone. The dependent needs the independent to make sense. Okay, so we're going to have a main clause or an independent clause, a subordinating clause. Just thinking is not enough. You must think of something. Okay, so just thinking is not enough. Makes sense. So we underline it once. You must think of something. That makes sense as well. So both of these are going to be independent. The last car of this pokey old freight train is just now coming into view, way down the line. So just now coming into view, way down the line. So this is actually one entire sentence. I do not see any subordinating clauses there. You should clean your lens so that your photos will be clear. Okay, this can stand alone. You should clean your lens. However, so that is dependent upon the rest of it. Don't ride on a motorcycle unless you have a helmet. Don't ride on a motorcycle makes sense by itself. Unless you have a helmet, depends on the other part. I'll go if I can. I'll go stands alone as an independent, whereas if I can needs the rest. Continue the rest of that. Going to the next page. Identifying independent and dependent clauses. Identify each bold group of words by writing IND for independent clause and DEP for dependent clause. The facts that are taught in math classes can be used in practical problems. So, that are taught in math classes cannot stand alone, so that makes it dependent. He needs to buy paint first. Makes sense by itself, so that makes it independent. You do not need to do B. Tomorrow we will continue with this packet. You can use the rest of the time to work on the pages.